Welcome to Chapter 12 of Same Lake, Different Boat, coming alongside people touched by disability. The title of Chapter 12 is On Wisdom, Questions Every Church Needs to Answer. In this chapter, Steph explores the essential question, what are the practical issues that every church needs to wisely discern in the context of ministries of mercy and justice? A special word of thanks to Reverend Timothy Keller, who graciously provided permission to build this book chapter on the principles he articulated in a keynote talk at a PCA Mercy Ministry Conference.
Some of the developing of the comfort zone is by having enough opportunity for people to interact with whether it's children or adults with special needs, so that simply we have the on-the-job training of breaking through our difficulties there, our lack of comfortability, and just realizing that this is something that if we truly love another person and have an eye towards sensibility, that we can move out of that and into their life with a sense of ministry. Our special needs ministry team has done a wonderful job of having opportunities to educate our congregation. We have had a special needs emphasis Sunday where from the pulpit, I as pastor will preach on a text from the scriptures that will open up something along the lines of the incarnational ministry of Christ, coming from all of the exceeding glory of His place at the Father's right hand and entering into our disability as fallen sinners, and reaching out to us with the magnificence of His gospel love. We preach through that, we talk through that, we have testimonies on Sunday evenings. We had a wonderful Sunday evening where we devoted our testimony time to the families in our church that have been impacted by special needs loved ones, and giving them a chance to educate us on what they've been through and what their struggles and blessings have been. And so our ministry team has helped us enormously with that. We want a special needs ministry team that is so thoughtful and skilled in being way ahead of the congregation, as it were, in helping us to think through and wrestle through how to give ourselves away in this area, so that they have some expertise and can help us all. So in that sense, it's unique and distinct, but the goal of that ministry team is to bring all of the congregation along and to begin to embrace this as a lifestyle. Whereas we sometimes speak about evangelism ministries in the church, I think the best form of evangelism is for our people to realize that that's the lifestyle of a believer. I think here also we need a ministry team that is always challenging us and educating us and teaching us, and with whom we are working intimately, but whose ministry helps us to see that this is to be the normal life of the church.
The essential question here in Chapter 12 is really the idea, what are the practical issues that every church needs to wisely discern in the context of ministries of mercy and justice? What are the wisdom issues that you're going to run into as a congregation? And one of the reasons I like this chapter is I feel like up to this point we've really talked about a biblical view of disability, we've talked about the idea of identification, we talked about respect-based relationships, relentlessness, what does the coming of the kingdom look like in the life of a person affected by disability, talked about all the different chapters on family issues, and then we worked into the church section on welcoming and hospitality, and then the idea of how is belonging different than that. And yet what this chapter does is it really gives us a chance to just look at what are the hard questions that come up when you try to put these things into practice. What are the practical kind of questions that you're going to run into when you go to put hands and feet on this in the local body of Christ. So what I did is basically looked at a presentation that Tim Keller had done at a PCA Mercy Conference back in 2001. And the title of Tim's presentation was Practical Issues of Mercy Ministry. And any of you that have ever heard Keller speak before, he's so insightful and he's so articulate that it's really pretty hard to beat Keller on these issues. So what I did, and I asked his permission to do this, is I built a chapter based on the 6 questions that Keller framed his presentation on. And what I did is I tried to give a brief explanation of what Keller's key points were related to those questions, and then I tried to make a disability application to those. So what I'll do in the presentation tonight is simply go through what are Keller's 6 questions and what are the key points that he made, and after I present his points, I'll give you a disability application to each point. So it'll be question 1 Keller, question 1 Steph, right? Question 2 Keller, question 2 Steph. So that's how we'll do it. And here are the 6 questions that Keller presented. And what I want to say too is a lot of the insights that Keller shares are from his readings on the work of Jonathan Edwards, who was a Puritan preacher. And Edwards wrote pretty extensively on some of the mercy-related issues that he dealt with in his congregation. And again, Keller found his principles to be extremely helpful. So here are the 6 questions. Whom do we help? How much do we help? When do we help? How do we help? From where do we help? And with what attitude do we help? Okay, whom do we help? How much do we help? When do we help? How do we help? From where do we help? And with what attitude do we help? And so let's look at the first one. The first question that Keller posed was, whom do we help? And in the context of this Mercy Ministry Conference, Tim was speaking specifically to addressing issues related to the poor. And so one thing I think you can do in terms of thinking about disability is if you think about the idea of the poor broadly, it really refers to the disadvantage. And people who have disabilities have some type of disadvantage. That's where the word handicap, right, comes from. There's a disadvantage there. Doesn't mean they don't have any advantages. It just means that there is a disadvantage that has to be contended with. So I think it's not hard to make the jump between the applications from the one to the other. So Keller's question in terms of whom do we help, the way he phrased it was the idea, do we only help the poor with capital P-O-O-R, the very poor, or the poor, right? I mean, how poor do you have to be in order to receive assistance from someone? And in other words, do you only come to the aid of someone who's in extreme need, or to anyone who's in need? And so here's the Edwards quote that Keller built his answer off of. Jonathan Edwards said this, that we should relieve our neighbor only in extremity is not agreeable to the rule of loving our neighbor as ourselves. We're wont to be much concerned about our own difficulties before we meet extremity. Should we not be so concerned for our neighbor? In other words, we're concerned for ourselves before we get to the point of being desperate. Should we only care about other people when they become in a situation that we would consider desperate? And so Keller says, of course not, right? That the golden rule would really suggest that we err on the side of generosity. So if you take that principle, the principle is don't set rigid guidelines, but err on the side of generosity. What would that look like in terms of a disability application? And in that case, the question again would be, whom do we help? But the concept, is it the disabled, disabled, capitals, right? Is it only the disabled or the disabled? In other words, how disabled do you have to be before the church is willing to participate? And that may seem like a silly question in some ways, but it's a question I actually get frequently in my work. Who qualifies, right? Idea. And if I think one of the things that really helps when you start thinking about it, we've mentioned this before, is the idea that disability covers a huge spectrum, right? I mean, it covers just a wide variety of different types of disabilities that are neurological or physical or psychological or intellectual, right? And so there are a whole wide groups of categories, and then there are all different levels of severity within those different categories. And so one of the things I always tell churches is that you'll have to, at some point, pick an area of focus. And that doesn't mean you necessarily say, well, we're going to serve people with neurological disabilities, right? Because topic-wise, that generally won't serve you well, because people with all different kinds of disabilities will hopefully be involved in your church. But for our church, for example, one of the things that we did is our focus was on facilitation. We said our focus is going going to be in the area of facilitating the inclusion of people with disabilities in the body life of the church. And if a person with a disability, their disability makes it difficult for them to be involved in one way or the other, then we're going to address that issue. But you might have a disability and it doesn't actually affect your involvement dramatically at all, right? So let's say somebody who had hearing impairment, but they had a hearing aid and the hearing aid functioned well, right? And they were able to carry on a conversation with someone and hear the sermon fine in church, right? That doesn't mean we would minimize the fact that they had a disability. It just means that their disability wouldn't actually require any facilitation from us. Does that make sense? So you have to pick some kind of area of focus, and for us, that's what we decided to focus on. And then what we did is we made the work of the Special Needs Committee was to work across all these other categories of the church, working with Sunday school or youth group or the worship team, any of those groups in the church, trying to help them to include people with disabilities in whatever it is that what they do. Now, just because our focus was on facilitation doesn't mean our care wouldn't extend to everyone. So let's say that a family had a child with ADHD who could actually attend reasonably well for a 45-minute Sunday school lesson. That child might not be the focus of what we were doing in terms of facilitation, but maybe that child's ADHD makes home life very difficult for his family in some ways. So one of the things we might do then is help the small group to have information on ADHD in order that the small group ministry in the church could be more supportive of the family, right? So just because facilitation was our focus issue doesn't mean we would ignore the care of any of the broader needs of the family. It just would not be the primary focus of where our energies lie. And another area would also be in terms of material needs. We had a young woman at our church who was hearing impaired and used a hearing aid. And she, again, as the example I gave earlier, didn't really need our assistance in terms of facilitation, but she had some financial challenges. And so in that case, our deacons came along, right? And so what the deacons did is they picked up that piece in terms of meeting her financial need related to her hearing aid, just as they would have met a financial need for any individual in the congregation who had one. Same kind of thing with maybe families who for one reason or another, let's say they have a family member who's disabled and the family, for one reason or another, can't be in a small group. That it just doesn't work into their schedule or transportation issues or whatever. And so what we would do then is work with the deacons to make sure that whatever kind of needs that family had that might be falling off the radar screen because they don't fit into that category of how needs are typically met at church, that we would make sure as a special needs committee then that the deacons were clued into providing care for that particular family and their unique disability-related needs. So recognize that disability covers a big spectrum, choose your focus, and then identify practical ways to address needs that might fall outside of that focus. So that's that old question, whom do we help? Question number 2 is the question of how much do we help? And Keller described this as really the issue of priority versus leftovers. Is mercy ministry going to be a core priority of the body of Christ in your local congregation, or is it going to be something that you do with whatever's left over after you do everything else? And in Keller's opinion, he really felt that what makes a mercy ministry really successful in the larger context of the church is how much the whole church body is on board. Because, Keller, if you've ever heard him speak before, is pretty enjoyable to listen to. He talks about how every church has distinct little lobbying groups, right? And so if a passion for mercy remains the sole concern of a small lobbying group, right, in the body of Christ, then it's probably always going to be a leftover type of issue. But if it's central to the ministry of the church, and the whole congregation has been brought on board through the effective teaching of the pulpit ministry and through the ways that the deacons or however in your congregation mercy ministry is accomplished, the way that they bring others on board, that's going to make the difference between whether it's just small bits and pieces that are left or it's really a central concern. One of the other points that Keller makes in this as well is this idea that those who have a heart for mercy have to be really careful about how you bring the rest of the church on board. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next chapter. But the whole idea is that it's the whole idea of mercy, right? Remember, is that voluntary sorrow, which joins itself to the suffering of another, right? It's voluntary, it's engaged, it's personal, and it's bathed in grace. And so if we become demanding about getting other people on board, right, we're violating the very principles that we're asking other people to do. And so that's one of the little warning flags that he gives out in his presentation. The disability application, how much do we help? Priority versus leftovers, right? Are people with disabilities going to remain on the fringe of the body life of the church, and will it just be the concern of a small group of people, or will the entire congregation take on a certain sense of responsibility to people with disabilities in their midst? And as I've mentioned before, it's really becomes on one level a church culture issue, right? That the church culture will really need to make somewhat of a paradigm shift, likely in most congregations. We'll need to make a paradigm shift from how they've thought about ministry before in terms of trying to incorporate people with disabilities, and a focus on integrating people with disabilities into the body life of the church will usually require some significant change in thinking about how things are done and why things are done the way they are. And again, this has to be modeled and encouraged from a posture of grace, or we will be violating the very principles that we're asking the congregation to put into action. I had a funny little experience one time. I was taking Freddie to the orthodontist, and we drove her to the orthodontist's office, and I pulled in, as usual we were late, and I pulled into the parking lot, and Freddie just gets this wry smile, and he looks at me and he goes, "Mom, and you of all people." And and he's being really cute and kind of funny. And I said, "What?" Because we were right next to the handicap space. I said, "I'm not parking in the handicap space." He goes, "No, but you blocked the ramp." He could have been shame, and he wasn't. He was funny about it, and he was really very gentle about the way that he said it. And it just reminded me that that's really, the posture that we have to have towards other people when we start to get a handle on some of these principles and how biblical they are. How do we communicate that to other people? One of the things that really helps me a lot is remembering how much I did not understand before Tim was born. And that gives me a lot of patience, with other people when I'm trying to help other people understand the importance of some of these things. And so it has to be done with a posture of grace. It involves a lot of education. In order for this to become a priority in the body life of the church, it really does require a lot of education. People have worldviews that need to shift. People have skill sets they need to learn, right? And especially a church leadership team, whether in your church it's a session or whatever it's called in Presbyterian circles, it's a session. Church leadership team really needs to be on board and own this collectively in order for there to be genuine long-term success, because the whole leadership team, the pastors and all, have to really see this as a significant value in the life of the church, and really see the connection to the gospel, right? When they get the connection to the gospel and they really, really own that and they preach that, then it really makes a difference in the local congregation. Another thing in terms of priority versus leftovers is to recognize that different people will have different ways that they'll be engaged in the lives of people with disabilities in the church. Fred and I did a presentation at a local church a number of years ago, and after it was all over, somebody raised their hand and they said, "Well, I can see the value in what you're talking about, but I can tell you this is not for me." And at first that was kind of a painful comment. But then when I thought about it, I thought, I think that he didn't really understand how broadly we could be involved in the lives of people with disabilities. So, for example, this fellow was probably saying, direct care, that's not my cup of tea. And you know what? Direct care probably isn't everybody's cup of tea. But let me give you an example. There was a fellow at our church, I think I mentioned before, Ben, who had a brain tumor and died at 13. And Ben loved music. And when he was living at home and on a vent and paralyzed from the time he was 11 to 13, there were guys in the church who had these great gifts of music and the ability to create electronic media. And so they would create these CDs for Ben that they would record all the music and live and take it and bring it to his house. That was a way that they ministered to him using their gifts gifts in a context that really met him in one of his areas of need. But it had nothing to do with suctioning his vent, right? Or being involved in any of those direct care type of capacities. And so there really are broad ways that we can be involved in each other's lives using the gifts that we have in the way that we're wired that way. And the other thing is just to think in terms of priority versus leftovers, thinking multidimensionally about families. Disability ministry really means ministering to the whole family, not just that slice of time on Sunday morning. It's really easy to compartmentalize disability ministry from 9:30 to 12. Sunday morning, 9:30 to 12. And that can be a great place to start. And yet, if we really understand some of those family issues we talked about before, then we won't put a fixed time period on mercy. We'll really be engaged with the life of a family throughout the week. All right, question 3, when do we help? In other words, do we put conditions on our help? And Keller will tell you that he believes this really is a function of our ideological divide politically, that as a rule, and that liberals will tend to see poverty as a function of social forces, and as a rule, conservatives will have a tendency to see poverty as a function of personal responsibility. Right? So is it social forces or is it personal responsibility? And then Tim says, in order to complicate it just a little further, Paul has a tendency in his writings to put conditions on aid, and Jesus says to give freely, right? And to lend and not worry about it. So, right, so that's why we kind of come to this with some tensions there. How much do we do? When do we step in and help? When do we step in and help? And the whole question then comes down to standards versus unrestricted aid. Do you have some kind of wooden standards, right, that you use in terms of assisting people, or do you have unrestricted aid? And the way that Keller described this, I thought was really actually very helpful. He said, if you think about how God deals with you and with me, his justifying grace is monergistic. It's one-directional, right? It's God moves towards you in his grace, and your salvation comes from God, right? It's not anything that you did that brings you to Christ. It's God's moving towards you. But our sanctification is synergistic, which means that it's still a function of grace, and yet there's a level which our cooperation is expected in that process of growth. And so Keller says if you look at it like justification and sanctification, monergism, synergism, he says you start out with no strings attached, and as you work with a family over an extended period of time, then you start to weave in some conditions for continued aids. So that's how you balance that issue of responsibility versus just unrestricted access to aid. So if you look at, and here's the final thought that has always helped me a lot, and I've thought about this many times. Keller quoted John Stott, who said, make sure that it's mercy that limits your mercy. In other words, if you ever need to restrict the amount of mercy that you're delivering to somebody in need, it needs to be mercy that limits your mercy. In other words, it's always for the benefit of the person that mercy is limited. It's not ever out of vengeance. And if you've ever worked with anybody who's really struggled for a long period of time, it's easy to get frustrated after a while, and at some point to just want to just cut the ropes, right? And just be like, I'm out. But Keller's point is God's never out when it comes to us, right? He doesn't cut the ropes. And so unless somebody pulls themselves out of being involved with you, Keller's urging to us is to follow Stott's advice and never, always make sure that it's mercy that limits mercy, not vengeance, okay? So in disability applications, when do we help? Again, same concept, standards versus unrestricted aid, and the issue is this idea of developing appropriate boundaries. Right? Families have ultimate responsibility for their family members who have a disabling condition, right? That's the way families are designed, and yet as the body of Christ, as the Christian family, we have responsibilities to each other. So it's developing that distinction, and this is a wisdom issue, of responsibility for versus responsibility to. Where does one stop and where does one start? And that's that whole idea of what I talked about several weeks ago from the Galatians 6 verses 2 to 5. Carry each other's burdens. Each one should carry his own load. The idea of the boulder that will crush you without assistance, or the backpack that may be heavy but you need to carry yourself. One of the things you run into in disability ministry with families is the whole entitlement mentality. Because of their involvement in the public service system, especially if you have children that were born with disabling conditions, and if you come through the public service system, age 0 to 3 is the early intervention system through the Department of Public Welfare, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, and that's an entitlement. The educational system from 3 to 21 in Pennsylvania is also an entitlement. And so that means by law that the region you live in must provide those services. It's very easy for a family to get accustomed to the must provide, right, framework, and to just bring that into the church then. And it has an element of demandingness to it if it's not tempered by grace. And so that's a little flashpoint that you can run into. The other thing, though, to remember, which is also very common and probably more common, is sometimes the wounding that families experience in the public service sector, where, for example, they may have a legal right to early intervention services, or may have a legal right to educational services, but they have to constantly fight with people to actually meet the obligations that are theirs by law. And so there's often a wounding that comes along with that for families who've had to fight to get basic services that their kids really do have legal access to. And so sometimes there's just a real tenderness on the part of those families, in the sense that they're fearful, right? They're afraid that you won't be faithful to them, just like other people have not been faithful to them. And so remember that whole idea of hospitality, being a welcoming church with justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Genuinely being faithful and saying, if you say you're going to do something for a family, then really do it, right? So that you can build that relationship of trust. And when that relationship of trust is built, that tension, that demandingness, that entitlement mentality, if it does exist there, will just tend to dissipate. And know, too, that for some people it's very hard to ask for help. For some people, they may be just crushed under a huge boulder, and they're still like, I got it, And so depending on the personality of the person, you just really are going to find different responses that way. The other thing, too, in terms of the whole boulder backpack thing, is that what might be a boulder for one person might be a backpack for another. You can't define it by the particular situation, because different people have different abilities to bear difficulty in different ways. And so anyway, when do we help? Standards versus unrestricted aid. The same principles apply in terms of working with a family touched by disability. Families responsible for their family member, but we have responsibilities to them. And recognize that while you may have issues of entitlement that'll come up from time to time in terms of the posture of a person, that more often you're going to run against wounded people who need to know that that the church is there to be faithful to them. Okay, Keller question number 4. How do we help? And Keller's point here is the whole idea of can we just do mercy, or do we have to get involved in issues of justice? And when Keller's talking about this, he's talking about the whole idea that, boy, when you start talking about justice, it sure sounds like social systems and politics. And he'll tell you, yep, it is. It is. And the whole issue is that, and the way Keller describes it, is that people are embedded in social systems, and that unless you actually work to improve the systems they live in, you aren't going to get very far in terms of helping the person. And so when you look at the disability applications, that the whole idea of justice versus mercy, how do we help? Can we only do mercy, or do we have to get involved in justice? The same thing applies in the context of disability as well. Disability ministry is a pro-life ministry in the broadest sense, right? It's the whole idea of not just being against abortion, but for the life of my neighbor from conception to natural death. And so, we need to be involved in our communities working on behalf of people with disabilities in the different contexts where their lives intersect throughout the week, because a lot of those things really do affect the quality of life of people with disabilities who will be in our congregations. So that could involve being involved in the local school district. Certainly Christian school teachers or Christian volunteers helping out in the special needs classroom, local Christian schools, so, like what Ruth does, and being involved in advocacy groups like the ARC. I was on the board of the ARC for a number of years. I was on the mental retardation board here in Lancaster County. So having a Christian voice in those settings where policy is influenced by those groups, that's an example of being involved in justice-related issues for people affected by disability. And one of the important things, too, I think, is this idea of being a voice. We have an opportunity as Christians to be a voice for people who otherwise don't have one. Now, people with physical disabilities and sensory disabilities are often excellent self-advocates. And anybody who can advocate for themselves, more power to them. That's great. I mean, and we ought to move out of the way when there's somebody with a disability who is a great self-advocate. But there are some of our friends with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities and profound intellectual disabilities, who cannot advocate for themselves. And so we have a responsibility to be a voice on behalf of people who don't have the opportunity either because they don't have the access, they don't have the capacity to represent themselves. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of that. I have a friend that lives at Friendship Community Apartments here in Ephrata, and she called me on the phone a couple weeks ago and said that she had been experiencing harassment by one of the high school students when she was walking past the high school. And this had been happening so frequently and was so bothersome to her that she had started walking a totally different route to work every day that was much longer just to avoid having to encounter this student. So I called the principal up and I told her what was going on. Tim and the principal are like this, so for good reasons anyway. And she took care of the situation, and that that's one of those simple. That's a justice issue, right? This woman who called me was experiencing a form of active oppression on behalf of another person, and as Christians we have a responsibility to engage those things. It didn't happen in the church building, right? But it happened in the community, and so we have a responsibility to be a voice for people who cannot do that for themselves. Question number 5, where do we help? And in Keller's presentation that he did, he was talking about the whole idea when we're working with underprivileged populations or with disadvantaged populations. Do you move to the places of need, right? Or do you commute? So in other words, do you live out in the suburbs and drive into the city if you're working with a city ministry, or do you move into the city and become part of that community? And Keller had a great quote from a fellow named Bob Lupton, who has been involved in inner city ministry in Atlanta. And Lupton says, programs do not restore community, neighbors do. Programs do not restore community, neighbors do. And so if we make the application over to disability ministry, where do we help? The idea becomes, is it in the church building or is it in the community? Right? Is it just in the building itself or is it in the community? Is it just on Sunday morning or is it throughout the week? And so when you're looking at the issue of families, as I mentioned before, you're going to be facility-based or family-based in the way that you do disability ministry. Facility-based or family-based. Because families affected by disability, they don't need programs, they need neighbors, right? They need good Christian neighbors who will be involved in their lives throughout the week. Another way to think about it too is not just are you going to be facility-based or family-based, but are you going to be in-house oriented or outward directed in your ministry? Are you going to only address the needs of families affected by disability who attend your church? Or are you going to have any type of outreach activities like respite care or those type of things that reach out into the larger community as well? And And one of the ways that sometimes, for when churches are trying to get up to speed in terms of ministering to people affected by disability, we've talked about that whole educational piece and the comfort zone. One of the ways that you can help the church to become more outward directed and more 24/7 directed and not just Sunday directed is to give people bite-sized outreach activities that they can sink their teeth into. So, for example, one of the ones I always recommend to churches is Johnny and Friends runs these family retreats around the country, and they're a great opportunity to get a group of people from church and go be immersed into the world of people who are affected often by very significant disabilities at a Johnny and Friends retreat for a week. You get training, right? You've got staff around, so it's a good opportunity to people who haven't had a lot of life experience there to really become neighbors for a whole week to somebody who has special needs. Another thing that you could do is the deacons at your church could organize some type of a Saturday morning missions trip, where you do things in a bite-sized piece that way, and maybe you go to a personal care home and do some visitation, or maybe you go to the house of a family who has a family member with Alzheimer's, and you give the caretaker there a morning off, right? There are lots of ways to do things and get your toe in the water there as far as learning how to become focused outside of the four walls of the church. And question number 6, with what attitude do we help? Is it a posture of respect or of pity? And Keller in his presentation basically said, this is my favorite quote of his, "We have to go into any place of need, expecting to learn from the people, expecting to be changed by the people, expecting to be a real servant of the people." I'm going to read that again. We have to go into any place of need, expecting to learn from the people, expecting to be changed by the people, and expecting to be a real servant of the people. So how does that translate into disability ministry? What's the jump over to that? Same thing that we spent a whole chapter on, right? Talking about respect-based relationships. That the attitude, is it going to be respect or is it going to be an attitude of pity? And what I would suggest to you is that your worldview is showing, right? Your worldview is showing depending on what your response is. So when you engage a person with a disability and you have a posture of pity towards that person, you're likely still carrying around a significant perception of disability being an abnormal part of an otherwise normal world. That's what breeds the pity perspective. If you find that you're pretty much indifferent to the needs of somebody with disability around you, then you're probably carrying around a perspective that says disability is a normal part of life in a normal world. Not my problem, right? It's only the biblical perspective that says that says disability is a normal part of life in an abnormal world that results in a relationship where there's a sense of identification and respect based on grace and the image of God, right? So your worldview is showing in terms of how you answer this question. I took Tim to the otolaryngologist one day, the ENT, because he was having some fluid issues in his ears, and we were in the waiting room, and there were some other little kids there, and they were all playing, and this little girl came up to Tim in the waiting room, and she goes, "Hi, my name's Ramone, Ramone." Tim flips his head back and looks at me and goes, "How do you spell pathetic?" So I didn't even know that Tim knew the word pathetic, but anyway, but isn't that the question? That's the issue that often when we're carrying around that historical view of disability, that abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world, we're essentially saying, how do you spell pathetic? Right? And you're never going to have a meaningful relationship to other people, disabled or not, right? Pick another category, it doesn't really matter. Unless we truly engage people from a posture of respect, expecting to learn from them, right? As Keller says, expecting to be changed by them, expecting to truly serve. So when you're involved with a family affected by disability, we should expect to learn from the parents, right? That the parents have walked a path that we have not walked. Expect to learn from the person who has the disability, right? And for that person, don't try to rescue them from the difficulties they have. Try to provide access, right? Try to find out, ask them, and find out how can I help provide access for you to have the freedom to do more things than you could do otherwise. And then also expect to learn from the siblings, because those forgotten siblings, right, are often very insightful little people. And have a lot to offer as well, and often a very big heart for their brother or sister who has special needs. So, questions every church needs to ask. Whom do we help? The disabled, capital D-I-S-A-B-L-E-D, or the disabled? Right, how much do we help? Will it be a priority of church life or the leftovers? When do we help? Will we use wooden standards or unrestricted aid? How do we help? Will it strictly be mercy? Will it also be justice? From where do we help? Will it be in the four walls of the church or out in the community as well? Will it only be on Sunday morning, or will it be 24/7 engagement with families throughout the week? And with what attitude do we help? Will it be a posture of respect or an attitude of pity? So go ahead and ask the questions. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Then you'll understand what's right and just and fair, every good path.
If graciously engaging people in justice and mercy was straightforward, this chapter would have been entitled, On Rules, What Every Church Should Do. Instead, it is aptly titled, On Wisdom, Questions Every Church Needs to Answer. Being committed to biblical principles is an essential starting place, but it takes wisdom to know how to implement those principles effectively in practice. Every congregation needs to look to the Lord for that wisdom. Please take a few moments to listen to the following interviews and consider the questions posed at the end of each segment.
One of the hard things about disability is that it is so very different. Even though Jerry was born with cerebral palsy, another person born with cerebral palsy may manifest in a different way. And so their needs are going to be very different, let alone then adding in the person who acquired disability later on, or the child with autism, or the parent who is caring for their aging parent with Alzheimer's, whatever it might be. So the needs of people with disabilities are hugely varied, which make it hard for the church. It also makes it hard for us as families to know what's really a legitimate need to bring to a certain group or place, or how do we meet those things. And it's hard for ministries and churches to know which needs can we meet and how to do that. And honestly, there have been times I've wanted to say to a family, you're not showing me that you really want to do anything about this. I don't think there's anything more I can do for you. And sometimes there is a time where we have to say, this is what we can offer. I'm sorry, this is all we have to offer you right now. If that's not what you're looking for, or you can't accept that right now, then I'm sorry. Sometimes I can offer them another resource to go for a different avenue. Sometimes I just have to say, if things change in your life, give me a call back. We'll still be here. I'll pray with them that God will lead the way. Other times, I think I was going that. Other times, God reminds me though, then and taps me on the shoulder and says, I haven't given up on you. And it's like, yeah, okay, God, I get it. And go back and say, I'm going to keep loving this family. I'm going to keep reaching out to them regardless, even if they turn down every opportunity, because until God tells me it's okay to let my hands go and that he's going to find their needs and meet their needs in another way, I need to keep doing that. So there's no easy answer. I wish there was, but it's really seeking God on each individual need and saying, what would you have me do in this need? What would you have me do in this one? And when is it time that we transition them to someplace else or help them see other things? When's the time that I need to speak the tough stuff into their lives and say, this is what you're asking for, but this isn't realistic, or this is what you're asking for, but I think that really stems back from this deeper need here. Let's take a look at this and then take a look at that need over there. So it's difficult because it is as varied as every person is.
While programs can have a role in church life, why is disability ministry essentially a relational ministry?
Saying the difficult thing to a person with a disability is really sometimes doing the most loving thing that we can ever do. We talk about that when we're doing training in churches, just in general disability awareness, that sometimes people say, well, I'm not comfortable with that person coming up hugging me. I don't even know them. Well, if it was somebody without a disability who came up and hugged you, Would you stop them? Well, yes. Well, then do the same thing for the person with autism or Down or whatever it might be. Set the limits. Give them the dignity and the respect of treating them the same way you would any other person. And that same thing happens when we're looking at meeting the needs of families with disabilities. That just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that we should either do everything for them, or doesn't mean that they need to pull themselves up completely by their bootstraps before we're going to do anything. We really have to look and figure out that balancing act and see what's going on in their lives, and then pour in to them what we are able to do, but then help them. There may be places where we need to then help them find other resources, or we need to be able to say, this is really what we can do, but we still want you to be a part of us. And so then we'll make some accommodations to figure out how we want you to be a part of us, even if this is all we can do. We've talked about that with church programs or even family retreat. There's a young man who really doesn't do well in a group setting and is not safe right now to be at camp or to be at church. So okay, we've had to set that limit for his own safety and for the rest of the others at camp. But that doesn't mean now we stop ministering to that family. How do we take church to him and his mom at home? How do we even think about taking camp? Is there something we can go do at their home for a day to provide that same respite for mom, to give him that experience? So while we may have to set some boundaries, we don't want to hold those so hard and fast that we just say we can't do this. But then what can we do instead of saying no? Here's how we can adapt that. Here's what we can do.
Why is it so important that mercy limits mercy and not fear or judgment?
I think will share verses from the Bible that encourage people each other churches, and I will use God's word always my favorite verse. Bible question mark Psalm 8 Oh Lord our Lord, thou majestic is your name in all earth. I think we'll share verses from the Bible that encourage people, other churches, and I will use God's Word, always my favorite verse, Bible, Psalm 8, O Lord, our Lord, thou majestic is your name in all earth. I love 10th Church because I learn the Bible, God's Word. I know that my friends in church love me. I also love them.
Do you think Nada's fellow parishioners treat her with pity or respect? How can you tell?